My work has been motivated by the question, do virtues or does virtuousness make a difference? Now, the reason that's interesting to me is that virtue, which in the original Latin and Greek means essentially the best of the human condition, the highest aspirations we hold for ourselves, is a virtuous state. When we are at our very best, we're in a virtuous condition. But the question is, if people are virtuous in a work setting where that's not the point of an organization, the organization generally exists to make money, to preserve jobs, to serve customers, does virtuousness matter at all? Because if I'm kind to you only to get a return, only to get a payback, it ceases by definition to be kindness. It's now manipulation. I'll only be kind if I can get what I want. Well, that's not kindness. So we don't need a payback, but the question is there one anyway? If we could foster or enable or help organizations implement virtuous practices, would it matter? So I'm going to tell you just about two very quick studies. One is with financial service organizations. Now, the reason that's important is because financial service organizations don't care anything at all about virtuousness. Show me the money, right? That's the least virtuous place on the planet's Wall Street. At least it's not non-virtuous, it's irrelevant. Excuse me. So we picked those organizations, even in the most difficult industry we can imagine. Does virtuous have any impact at all? And then you'd expect it in healthcare. So we kind of had two different sets of organizations. One when you would expect compassionate and care and so support would matter, and one would you'd expect it would not matter. That's the study. Okay. Here are the dimensions of virtuousness that were measured. This is an instrument that was refined from 100 and some items down to about 30 items, and it's available if you'd like it. I'm happy to send you this instrument you can use in your own research. But after lots and lots of different kinds of psychometrics, here are the dimensions that ended up holding together pretty well psychometrically, and in fact, you can see the alpha is above 9 for each of these scales, so it's very highly reliable. And it's been validated in all these different industries, and I won't talk about that. Here is very briefly and I'll go short so we have some time for questions. Here's the results of our study in financial service organizations. What we discovered is if we can help organizations implement virtuous practices. Now, what does that mean? Higher scores in compassion, higher scores in forgiveness, higher scores in support of one another and so on, caring, even in an environment where that's not valued. This slide simply summarizes that we measured improvement scores and then look a year and a half later at outcome scores. And in this case, it's simply profitability. Do organizations make more money when they are more virtuous? The answer is yes, absolutely. That R square stands for the amount of variance accounted for. I have in my briefcase an article I'm reading for a journal. The R square in that study is 0.1. 10% of the variance can be accounted for, and they're pretty proud of the fact that I can account for 10% of the variance. We can account for almost half the variance in profitability if I just know the extent to which virtuous practices are being implemented in these organizations. It's almost so strong as to be unbelievable. But the point is, virtuousness matters a lot. And then it's not only profitability. And by the way, the profitability, some people say, well, we measure it in terms of simply cash flow. Other people say we measure it in terms of the amount of revenue per person, and so on. So we said, fine, we'll measure it in any way you want. We'll measure it in 6 different ways, and it still holds. And it's not only profitability, but you see in these other areas as well, much more soft areas, turnover and employee engagement and retention of customers and so on. Virtuousness pays. Healthcare, you'd expect it. That is, this study was done where we simply took 30 organizations, healthcare organizations. they were willing to take this seriously, and some did better than others. So when they improve on virtuousness scores, 2 years later, what happens to the dimensions they care about? That is, we asked them to identify the effectiveness dimensions that were important to them. And bingo, patient care, quality goes up. Physician-nurse relationships, which are often not very great, are improved. I mean, double-digit improvement in all kinds of areas in each of these, on each of these dimensions. Now, the question is, why is that? And this is the last slide I'll show you. This is the theory. There are, in fact, amplifying effects. That is, if I am exposed to virtuousness, I have a tendency to respond in kind. I'm inspired, I'm elevated. There is, in fact, an amplifying effect associated with virtuousness. There's also a buffering effect when people, and you've heard some of these presentations before. Barbara Fredrickson's wonderful work sort of talks about this. It creates more resilience, as Ned mentions. In fact, people become stronger in the presence of virtuousness. So it's easier to withstand the difficulties we face. And in addition to that, there's something called a heliotropic effect, which essentially is all living systems, everything alive, from single-cell organisms to complex human systems, everything alive has a tendency toward the light and away from dark, or toward that which is life-giving, away from that which is life-depleting. Makes sense, doesn't it? Evolutionary theory would suggest that which enhances or engenders life is attractive. That which endangers or depletes life is, I resist that or flee from that. That means all living systems have a tendency to flourish in the presence of positive energy and diminish in the presence of negative energy. And that's one of the theories of why this works, and there's more to it than that. Now, I wanted to leave time. We only have 5 or so minutes left before we have to quit, but that's this set of studies, and there are more, but this set of studies essentially says at the very bottom line, virtuousness, positive practices, positive energy pays off. In fact, even in terms of profitability, productivity, customer satisfaction, and so on. Now, questions. Let's stop presenting and have dialogue or interaction or questions or comments or yeah buts.
Just go for it?
Great.
These were great, thank you.
These mics are now on so they can respond.
I have questions for all of you, but I'm just going to stick with you for a second. In your work on positive leadership, you talk about positive energizers in the workplace. My question is, if the positive energizers demonstrate the virtuous practices that you're talking about, do they have more of an impact on fellow workers than other people?
They do. At 1 o'clock, I'm going to show you about positive energy. And as it turns out, but I won't do it now. But as it turns out, big impact. That's the slide. That's the slide.
We'll preview.
Sorry. But good question, because positive energy is one of the ways in which it's one of the effects or sort of correlates of virtuous practices. It's almost impossible to imagine somebody resisting compassionate love support over time. I can be so angry for a while as to resist it, but over time I cannot. The human condition suggests we cannot resist virtuousness. That's part of that amplifying effect or the heliotropic effect. Well, so when you think about, okay, well, who is it that I flourish in the presence of? Positive energizers, by definition heliotropic, almost always are synonymous with expressing or demonstrating, enabling virtuousness, helping people flourish. So positive energy and virtue go together. A strong empirical correlation as well. Good question. Thanks.
Kim, regarding your study on virtuousness in financial service organizations, 60% of my business is with financial services, so that fascinates me.
Fantastic.
So my question is, that was a study of what is currently present in those organizations. So in other words, high-performing teams or high-performing organizations that are financially stable are more virtuous. Is it possible that because they've achieved a level of financial stability, they have more time and effort to input the virtuousness? Or is there a way that if you input virtuousness, you could actually increase productivity?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The question is, what's the causal link? Is it because we're making so much money, everything's great? Sure, we can be kind and compassionate and happy and trusting and so on. Baloney. So what we did in this particular study, and again, in 3 or 4 minutes, it's hard to explain this, but what we did in this study is we picked 40 organizations who essentially say, we essentially say to them, are you willing to participate in this study, have us expose you to some information, give you some tools and techniques and practices, and have you take them seriously? And they say, okay, sure, we'll participate. Some do well, some don't. So you end up a normal curve, as you'd expect, so a lot of variance. And then what we essentially do is to ask the question, what about these really high-performing, that is, not high-performing, what about the organizations that did a good job and improved markedly in their Virtuousness scores versus those who didn't so much? So let's look over time, 2 years later, year and a half later. Now let's look at your scores compared to where you were. So it gets toward the causality. Still may be reversed, but we're trying to get a sense of which comes first. And it looks like 2 years later, if you improved in virtuousness, you did better. Really a good question.
Hi, thank you for the chance for asking. I'm confused. In my company, one of my staff is very kind to all of the people, their colleagues, their customers, and we all know kindness is a kind of virtue, right? It's virtue. It's one of the virtue.
Yes.
But we expect that colleagues will feel gratitude, will be thankful for him, and the customers will come back, will improve his performance in his work. But the result is pathetic. His colleagues gave more difficult work to him to do. And if we ask, hey, who want extra work? And the colleagues will say, Jim will do it. We'll go and play. And what about the customers? Customers will take advantage of his time, ask him to do a favor for him. But if he asked the customers to pay or something, they will run away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel very confused. So I don't know how to deal with this problem and how to talk with him. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful question. The question is, wait a minute, I know some guy who's kind and compassionate, and people walk all over him, the customers don't respond, he's not very effective, he's kind of soft and syrupy, and that's the single biggest criticism we get when we walk into an organization and say something like, well, we'd like to study compassion and kindness and humility and forgiveness. People say, come on, soupy, syrupy, saccharine sweet, Pollyanna-ish. In fact, you show me how this will pay off, I'll pay attention. Otherwise, hey, look, I got other things to do. Competitive strategy is, frankly, what I care about. So what's the answer, or is there an answer? And by the way, please, let me stop. And Walter, you take it.
I can give it
first,
a shot.
Please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
So to plug a former Michigan Wolverine grad, Adam Grant, he just wrote a book called Give and Take. I just finished reading it. And what he kind of posits is that selfishness and selflessness are on two different continuums, and that you can be both. And you can, and not selfishness in a bad way, but you can be selfless and still have ambition and do the right thing to make your organization better, but at the same time live with virtue and be a giver and be compassionate and be kind. So they're separate. We tend to put it on the same continuum, but they're really different. And it's a wonderful book.
All right, thank you.
So kindness and compassion doesn't account, the R square is not 100. I mean, it is possible to be inauthentic. It is possible to not have other attributes that would lead to success. So if only kindness and compassion were the factor that would lead us all to success, we'd all be kind and compassionate. But it's not. It's so much broader than that. And you start thinking about skills. I mean, the reason Chris and Marty did have the VIA, I mean, the values in action, and the reason there are strengths finders, and the reason there are all these instruments to try to figure out what your signature strengths are, because there's a big, broad continuum. One of them is not going to account for all the variance. So I know kind people who are not very effective, you know. I mean, professional baseball players may be kind, but they can't hit, for heaven's sake. I need the hitting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They were excellent presentations. My question was really to understand a little bit more about what are the virtuousness practices that you bring to the organizations? The
virtuous practices, I can't get this to go backwards, but we have, well, first of all, the website centerforpos.com has lots of those. One of the, sorry, I'm going to get this eventually. One of the purposes of some of the material that we've provided is to identify or highlight the practices. There we go. Whoops, sorry. So there's a book right there that says Practicing Positive Leadership. It's actually not out yet. It's coming out in August. That's the specific purpose of that book is to identify 5 different sets, maybe 25 practices. What could I do Monday morning to try to help my organization improve in some way? And so that's one resource. I'm sorry.
Are they the ones you used in the study?
I'm sorry?
Were those practices the ones you used in this study?
Some of them, not all. But get on the Center for POS website. There's one article. It's actually a case study. It's an article. And we essentially did a study of the CEO of the Prudential Financial Services piece of the rock. He wakes up every morning trying to figure out how to implement this himself and in his own life. And there's not a long list, but there are probably a dozen things he did, which he explains, turned his organization around from a $120 million loss to a $40 million profit in 1 year. And he attributes it all to these positive practices. So they're listed, just not enough time here.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more. Thanks.
Carlos, very briefly,
Great.
You mentioned the agree-disagree assessment, and you went with the average, below average assessment. And what you got was what I would expect based on what I've heard, which is, for example, if you ask this room, are you above average for the average IPA member, 80% of us would say, yes, we're above average. So is it better or worse to use averages or agree-disagree statements in assessing corporate well-being?
When you look at the scales that we use, in some questions we use average, below, and above average, in the intermediate range. But the extreme, the anchor point for the scale were not worded in that way of much below average or much above average, but we gave very specific anchoring points that elicited in memory a behavioral response. So we use a little bit of a crutch, not throughout the questionnaire. In some instances, it was forcing the language to come with a more specific definition of what the intermediate range was. But in all instances, the anchor points were not completely or completely agree or completely average at all. Thank you for your question, and you're perceptive.
You've been very kind and very patient. Thank you very much. We're slightly over time. Thank you.